You've probably noticed something that doesn't quite add up. Governments are spending more than ever. Large support programs, rising deficits, and constant intervention have become normal. And yet, the economy doesn't immediately collapse. In fact, for long periods, it keeps going. So the question begins to shift. Not how can we afford this, but what actually limits is. If governments can create money, what really stops them? And where do those limits show up? In the previous episodes, we introduced policy frameworks as ways governments and institutions manage economic systems over time. Keynesianism focused on stabilizing the system. Neoliberalism focused on expanding market mechanisms and reducing direct control. But in TNBC, we separate ideology, systems, and governance. Ideology describes what a framework aims to achieve. Systems describe how economic activity behaves in practice, and governance describes how rules are applied and enforced. So the focus here is not what a framework promises, but how it behaves in the real world. Modern monetary theory takes a different starting point. It begins with a simple idea. A government that issues its own currency is not constrained in the same way as a household. Unlike households or businesses, it does not need to earn money before it can spend. This changes how we think about limits. If spending is not constrained in the traditional financial sense, then the question shifts. What actually limits how much can be spent? In practice, the limit becomes real. The economy can only absorb so much activity at a given time. Labor, materials, and productive capacity define what is possible. And when those limits are approached, pressure begins to show up in prices. So the constraint does not disappear. It shifts from money to the real economy. But to understand how that plays out, we need to step back. Economic activity sits at the center of a wider environment shaped by political institutions, societal behavior, and technological infrastructure. These elements interact continuously and influence outcomes over time. So when money creation increases, it doesn't just affect spending. It spreads through the entire economy, across production, labor markets, supply chains, and expectations. And that raises the key question. If financial limits are relaxed, how does the rest of the economy absorb that pressure? Think about it in practice. Instead of asking whether governments can spend, we begin asking how much the system can absorb. Pressure shows up not in budgets, but in prices. Not immediately, but gradually. We saw this dynamic clearly after the large-scale fiscal responses in 2020-2021. Stimulus supported activity, but as demand pressed against real-world limits, inflation rose noticeably. So the system appears more flexible on the surface, but the constraints are still there. They have simply moved. And this creates a reinforcing dynamic. The more the system relies on monetary flexibility, the more it depends on managing its consequences. As spending increases, inflation must be controlled. As flexibility expands, coordination becomes more important. Over time, flexibility and control begin to move together. This is where the shift in power becomes visible. On the monetary power ladder, money creation becomes a central tool of management. On the political power ladder, decisions about spending and distribution become more significant. So power doesn't disappear. It becomes more concentrated in how trade-offs are managed. At this point, it helps to simplify what we have been building. Every economy follows a sequence. A system model defines how activity is structured. A policy framework defines how that system is managed. That combination shapes system behavior and over time produces real-world outcomes. So instead of focusing on theory, we can begin to see how systems actually evolve. But when we apply this across different systems and frameworks, a pattern begins to emerge. Different combinations create different starting points, but the outcomes follow recognizable tendencies. Stabilization tends to lead to dependency. Market expansion tends to lead to concentration. Monetary flexibility tends to shift constraints elsewhere. And even when systems look different on the surface, their behavior begins to align over time. And this reveals something deeper. Modern monetary theory does not remove limits. It changes where those limits appear. Financial constraints become less visible, but real-world constraints become more important, especially in complex late-cycle societies where systems are already highly interconnected. So the question is not whether money can be created. It can. The question is where the system absorbs the cost. What kind of system emerges when money is no longer the constraint, but everything else is? If you want to understand how these systems fit together, TNBC Explainers breaks down the core concepts one by one. Modern monetary theory is part of TNBC Explainers Module 3. Economy, money, and financial power. This is TNBC Explainers, understanding how the world actually works. In Part 1, we explored how perception and narratives shape behavior. In Part 2, how power is structured and exercised. And in Part 3, how economic and monetary systems interact. Together, they form a broader framework for understanding the societies we live in. Explore the TNBC Explainers course via the YouTube course list or visit thenextbigcycle.world for the full course overview and background. This is The Next Big Cycle. TNBC Explainers, your guide to understanding the systems shaping the world around you. TNBC Explainers is a growing YouTube course. New concepts are added over time,